So, as we have already discussed, the Elizabethan era was truly the golden age for theatrical endeavors. At no other time in history, either before or since, was theater as influential within its own culture as it was during this time period. However, as history has taught us again and again and again, it's that all good things must eventually come to an end. And for theater, and indeed for a great many things, the end was signified by the start of the English Civil War. Now, a historian, a history teacher, can give you far greater insight into the causes, the actual fighting, and the after effects of the English Civil War than I'm capable of doing. But putting it very simply, breaking it down for the purposes of our discussion, the English Civil War was fought between those that were loyal to the crown, to the monarchy, and these were called royalists or cavaliers, and those who sought to destroy the monarchy. These are people who wanted the rule of England to be placed solely in the hands of Parliament, and these were called parliamentarians or Roundheads because of the hats that they would wear. And, long story short, the Roundheads won. And several things happened very, very quickly once the Roundheads had taken power. First of all, the King of England, King Charles I, was executed, had his head cut off. His infant son, King Charles II, was whisked away to France to protect him from the same fate that befell his father. And 3, England was put into the hands of the Roundheads, who established the Commonwealth of England under the leadership of a man named Oliver Cromwell. So, what did all of this mean for theater? Well, nothing good. You see, the Roundheads were primarily a Puritan group. And as we have seen, as we've gone through our little journey throughout theatrical history, the relationship between theater and the church is strained at best. Despite the fact that during the Elizabethan era, theater was the most popular form of entertainment, a form of entertainment enjoyed by everyone from the lowliest dirt farmer all the way up to the King and Queen of England themselves. Despite all of that, the church still looked down on it and still condemned it. We are still 20, 30 years away from when actors were allowed to be buried in consummated ground. Yeah, I don't think I've mentioned that before. But for a huge span of history, actors were not allowed to be buried in cemeteries. That's how strongly the church felt that the theater and anyone who participated in it was doing the work of the devil. So the Roundheads come in and theater goes out. Theaters are closing down one by one by one by one. So, with the theaters closed, we must now travel to France and take a look at what is going on there. Why? Because what is happening in France is going to have a direct effect on what happens to the rest of theater in about 15, 20 years. France is one of the places where the theater is not only alive, it is thriving. However, the plays of the 17th century French theater look very, very different from those that were being done in the Elizabethan era. Primarily because the plays going on in France were still very, very dedicated to the rules of the neoclassics. So they are still following the guidelines set down during the Italian Renaissance by the neoclassic thinkers. Their plays still observe the three unities. Their plays still go with decorum and verisimilitude. all those rules that we've discussed, all those rules that Shakespeare and the other Elizabethan playwrights took such great joy in smashing, the French still hold up as the best way to present theater. Let me give you a little example of just how passionately the French valued the neoclassic system. There is one of the popular plays from that era is a play called The Cid by Pierre Corneille, and I have totally butchered that gentleman's name, and I apologize. This was a hugely successful play. This is about a man who kills his girlfriend's father in a duel, runs off, conquers the Moors, kills other people in a duel, and then comes back and convinces his girlfriend to marry him, even though he has killed her father in a duel. It's a drama. It's based on a Spanish play. This was a hugely popular play at the time. People loved this play, but the critics destroyed it because it did not follow the neoclassical ideals. They said that there was too much action in it for it to logically take place within a 24-hour period. It mixed genres. It was a serious play that had a happy ending. And they felt that the young lady in the play, agreeing to marry the man who killed her father, albeit in an honorable duel, did not show consistency with that type of character. So she had broken the rules of decorum. So even though this play was a huge success, the critics lambasted it. That's how passionately the French felt about the neoclassical ideas. One of the other things to keep in mind about the French plays is that the Cid is kind of an oddity within it, because most of the plays of the French theater around this time, the 17th century, were farces. They weren't farces in the way that the Romans kind of thought of them. They were much less slapsticky. They had some in there, but the French plays were more what we would later come to call comedy of manners. You know, watching people very, oh my goodness, oh, and then something outrageous happens, oh my goodness, this is most unorthodox, The farces of the 17th century of France specifically were a lot less about, people falling over and hitting each other, and a lot more about door slamming. They became known as door slam comedies. If you've ever seen an episode of Scooby-Doo and you ever see that scene where they're being chased by the ghost and they go down a long hallway with a bunch of doors and they're going back and forth in and out of the doors and they're coming out in wrong order and they're coming out of a door here but they're exiting through one all the way down the hall and all these doors are just slamming and all these things are coming in and out. That's kind of what the farces of the French theater looked like, believe it or not. Now, we're going to simplify the French theater of the 17th century down, and we are going to look at it through the lens of just one person, probably the most famous playwright to come out of that era, a gentleman by the name of Moliere. Moliere is going to kind of be our Rosetta Stone, and while not everyone followed his example, he, kind of like Shakespeare for the Elizabethan era, is the playwright that most embodies that era of French theater. The 17th century French playwright Molière remains one of the most popular dramatists of all time. His plays earned the respect and patronage of enlightened theatergoers in his own time, and today his plays remain some of the most beloved and most frequently produced of any classical playwright other than Shakespeare. Molière left university at the age of 21 in 1643 and founded his own theater. Theater lasted for about 2 years until it went bankrupt and he was imprisoned for debt. Forced out of Paris due to his poor economical conditions, he and his theater troupe would play the various French provinces. So they would become kind of a touring company, almost in the vein of the Commedia dell'arte. This would last till about 1658. Now, during this time, Moliere put it to good use, and he used this self-imposed exile to fine-tune his craft as a playwright and would become a very accomplished writer. So accomplished that his theater troupe would eventually win the praises of King Louis XIV, and the king himself would help Moliere and his company regain credibility. Moliere was a comic playwright. He specialized in the type of farce that was very popular in France at the time. His work would often raise quite a bit of controversy because he insisted on depicting the vices and follies of humanity truthfully. And when I say humanity, his primary target was usually the upper class, the rich and the well-educated. And these folks did not appreciate going to the theater and having their perceived faults thrown right back in their face in such a public way. It is a good thing that Moliere was such a favorite of the king's, because without that support, there is no way he would have gotten away with half the stuff he got away with. And indeed, several times, several of his plays were banned until the king stepped in and said, no, they're not. Moliere wrote in the neoclassical form, which was, of course, the style of the time. However, even he did not stick to it 100%. For example, famously, many of his plays are resolved via the use of a deus ex machina. Now, not the actual machine that would fly people in and out, but rather the literary device wherein the day is saved via a hitherto unforeseen outside force that comes in, sets everything right, and then disappears. The dialogue of Moliere plays is rather interesting. It's still written in poetic verse, but not the blank verse or iambic pentameter that we've come to know from Shakespeare and Marlowe and people of that nature. Rather, Moliere's plays are written in what we call rhyming couplets. His dialogue actually rhymes. For example, a line from his Tartuffe, Act 4, Scene 1. But I am not commanded by the Bible to live with one who smears me with libel. One of the interesting things about Moliere's work when we look at it is we see that he was highly, highly influenced by the performances of the Commedia dell'arte. You can see this influence in all of his most famous works. The storylines are very similar to the scenarios that were used in the Commedia performance, as most of them involve a pair of young lovers who are trying to get married despite the efforts of some very wacky characters to prevent them from doing so. The characters themselves resemble the stock types found in Commedia. Plays like The Imaginary Invalid, The Misanthrope, Tartuffe all have a Pantalone character, a lecherous or greedy old man who would rather sell his daughter off to someone she doesn't love if it means he gets something out of it. They all have some form of the doctore character, some kind of foolish lawyer or doctor. Moliere loved taking shots at doctors for whatever reason. The plays also usually feature a helpful servant, somebody who is willing to go behind her master's back and help the young lovers get married despite the father's plans. So very reminiscent of the Harlequin character. Another interesting aspect of Moliere's writing is that he had the ability to combine farcical humor with witty dialogue and a keen eye for human foibles and fallibility. Particularly, the human tendency to fall prey to fast-talking con men and our willingness to be taken in by people who tell us what we want to hear. This would lead to probably his most famous and most beloved play.
and that would be this one, the aforementioned Tartuffe. Tartuffe is the story of a con man who pretends to be a holy man and cons a gullible rich person out of all of their possessions. Suffice it to say, this play did not go over well initially with some of the audience. They did not like the idea of a holy man being held up as a con man, to which Moliere rebutted, saying he's not a holy man who's a con man. He is a con man pretending to be a holy man. And it is not an indictment of religion. It's an indictment of people who are willing to believe televangelists or false prophets.